It is Al-Qaeda's first strike at America. Hundreds are killed by suicide bombs at 2 US embassies in Africa.
The scale of the bombing was enormous.
It is the beginning of a new era of terrorism.
You can't really overstate the impact. This was the declaration of war on the United States.
For the CIA, there's only one man who can hunt down the killers. The legendary operative, John Bennett.
He is entrepreneurial, aggressive. He is exactly the sort of person in a war zone that you would want in charge.
The terrorists are operating from a country that's a no-go zone for the US.
It was very dangerous. These Somali clans will turn you over for a few dollars.
The top-secret mission? Infiltrate the most dangerous country in the world, deliver Operation Celestial Balance, and work with SEAL Team 6 to ensure that justice is done. It's a bustling August morning in Nairobi, the capital of the East African state of Kenya. If it's famous for anything, it's for its world-class safari parks and pristine beaches. It's a part of Africa that doesn't often make the news headlines. Just after 10:30 a.m., a truck drives up to the US Embassy. And instead of slowing at the barrier, it accelerates.
The scale of the bombing was enormous. It was not only the explosive capacity which destroyed the embassy and nearby buildings, but the shockwave shattered glass for many, many blocks around. Most of the Kenyans who were injured badly were hit by flying glass.
The final death toll is 12 Americans and 200 Kenyans, with over 4,000 injured. Almost simultaneously, another suicide bomb explodes outside the US Embassy in Dar es Salaam, the capital of the neighboring country of Tanzania. Nothing has ever happened like this before to Americans in the region. It's an incomprehensible act that stuns the world.
Our teams are on the ground in Africa. They are tending to the wounded. They are providing security. They are searching and finding evidence. We will do whatever we can to bring the murderers to justice.
To a handful of experts inside America's intelligence and security agencies, it's immediately obvious that the sophistication of an operation like this can't have come from locals working alone. The suspicion is that a Saudi prince few have heard of, called Osama bin Laden, is behind the attacks. Earlier in the year, he declared a holy war on the US, and now it's clear he wants the world to know that America has an implacable enemy that will strike without warning.
The 1998 embassy bombings were a turning point. Until then, Al-Qaeda had been a shadowy, behind-the-scenes presence. It wasn't really known to the public, wasn't widely known outside intelligence circles. You can't really overstate the impact. This was the declaration of war on the United States.
The only explanation for the location of the attacks is the ease with which they can be carried out. Poor security, corruption, and easy targets like Western mass tourism make the country irresistible to a burgeoning terror organization.
The embassy bombing revealed the fact that the East Africa al-Qaeda cell found Kenya to be actually quite a permissive environment to work in. They had both aggrieved Muslim coastal populations that they could find some support from. They had opportunities, thanks to Kenya's corrupt political system and police, to operate with near impunity, and they had thousands of soft targets.
Almost immediately, the US hits back at known al-Qaeda targets.
Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan.
But they fail to achieve their objectives. The strikes on a base in Sudan destroy a harmless pharmaceutical factory. 75 missiles hit 4 al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan in an attempt to kill Osama bin Laden. But he's not in any of them. As well as tracking down Osama bin Laden, the CIA wants the local cell responsible for the planning and the execution of the attacks. Within hours of the bombing, Kenyan police have an amazing stroke of luck. They arrest a man who turns out to be one of the suicide bombers, who panicked and fled at the last minute. On his cell phone are numbers that confirm his links to al-Qaeda. But he gives an even more valuable piece of information: the name of his al-Qaeda handler in Nairobi. That name is Harun Fazul. The CIA Nairobi station immediately get to work. They check NSA wiretaps of Osama bin Laden's calls to Nairobi and see regular connections to the offices of an aid charity and conversations with an employee there called Fazul. When investigators raid the charity's offices, they discover fake passports that show that Harun Fazul is an alias used by someone called Fazul Abdullah Mohammed. It turns out he's a hardened terrorist with over a decade's experience.
Fazul had a very long and winding background. He moved to several different places, in and out of Africa, even going as far as going to Pakistan. He was the personal secretary to Osama bin Laden, and then moved with bin Laden back to Sudan. Fazul really became one of the guys that was a foreign operations director, took on this role of doing the big external foreign attacks for al-Qaeda, and specifically the Horn of Africa. He would make trips into Kenya, and so leading up to the embassy bombings, he would go there, set up logistics, look at financing and money.
Investigators also discover that Fazul is assisted by a young protege called Saleh Ali Nabhan. Further interrogations reveal that the two terrorists fled Kenya on the eve of the bombing. CIA analysts conclude they must have gone to one particular country. Kenya's violent, lawless, and chaotic neighbor, Somalia, is the perfect safe haven for terrorists on the run. For years, it's been a no-go area for Americans, thanks to the notorious Battle of Mogadishu 5 years earlier. The shooting down of a Black Hawk helicopter and the drawn-out rescue attempt that followed led to massive American casualties. It later became known as Black Hawk Down.
18 U.S. Army Rangers were killed. Hundreds of Somalis died in that. The U.S. pulled out, and Somalia was left to its own devices for a number of years.
The CIA now realizes that going after Fazul and Nabhan means chasing them down to the one place where no commander wants to send his men. Somalia is a dead zone, where the US has no base, no friends, and no contacts.
The assets that the US intelligence community had in Somalia were practically non-existent. When the US troops pulled out of Mogadishu in 1993, the CIA station went with them. That was the last CIA presence in the country.
The CIA is virtually in the dark and will need to build an intelligence gathering operation from the ground up.
Very difficult to go in there and really get any sort of intelligence going. There's not a lot of signals intelligence, so you really have to rely on human intelligence.
And then the CIA makes another disturbing discovery. Because Kenya's Muslims distrust the US-backed Christian government, Al-Qaeda sympathizers straddle the border of Kenya and Somalia. It's a situation which suits the terrorists perfectly.
The internal dynamics of Kenya really play to the strengths of guys like Fazul and Nabhan. So we partner with the Kenyan government, which is predominantly Christian and from the tribes of central Kenya, but the Kenyan Muslim coast has always been a minority and a somewhat oppressed minority. And because there is that division in that country, Nabhan and Fazul can move up and down the coast of Kenya and in these Muslim populations.
Intelligence comes in that Fazul and Nabhan are most likely being protected by a Muslim fishing community on one of the many islands that dot the coast of Kenya.
Fazul built networks both in Nairobi, especially in a neighborhood known as Eastleigh, which is a slum area of Nairobi, and he also did that up and down the coast of Kenya. He would move up and down through those locations and then move back into Somalia, and even there he would pick up Kenyans who he would train in Somalia, and they would move back into Kenya. That knew how to sort of naturally navigate these networks, I think, and it gave them a certain ability to move up and down the coast, where once it came time to execute an attack, they knew exactly how to do it, and they had a robust network to do that.
Posing as fishermen and married into local families, the cell now starts making inroads into the ports of Somalia, building logistics and networks to enable their next attack.
It turned out that the East Africa Al-Qaeda cell was using Somalia the same way a lot of business people were using Somalia, basically as the world's largest duty-free shop. The ports there, the seaports where you could move money men, materiel from beach to truck and into East Africa, no questions asked.
The cell now have a presence in both countries and are able to switch at a moment's notice when it suits them, maximizing the proximity of a failed state to a land effectively defenseless from terrorism.
What's different about Kenya as well as opposed to Somalia, especially for Al-Qaeda, is access to Western targets. To attack a Westerner from Somalia, they have to project a long way. They have to really build out an operation. You can't do that unless you have a support network in another country with access to targets. They could access Western targets there. They had a network that could support them, and they had a safe haven in Somalia that they could flee to. So Kenya became a right place for Fazul and Nabhan to essentially conduct attacks on the West.
The CIA know that with all its resources and power, the US could send in troops and bring the terrorists to justice. But since the disaster of Black Hawk Down, nobody in Washington has much interest in tackling Somalia. Then one day in September 2001, all that changes.
And have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
9/11 suddenly put Somalia on the front burner of U.S. counterterrorism concerns. The U.S. government had very good reason to believe that as it hit al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda would disperse to ungoverned space, places where it would be beyond the reach of rule of law. And Somalia, of course, is a country with a completely collapsed state, an Islamic country. And so Somalia immediately garnered a lot of attention.
With an overnight change in policy towards the terror threat in Africa, the hunt for the masterminds behind the embassy bombings now becomes a top priority. The US is now determined to prevent Somalia becoming a haven for al-Qaeda. And President Bush allocates $100 million of military spending to the region. At the center of the package is an expanded military base on Somalia's northern border and a massive investment in the CIA operation in Kenya with a substantial influx of intelligence operatives and special forces.
So the CIA station in Nairobi was dramatically reinforced. We brought in a bunch of military guys. You know, the cover was they were part of a training mission for the Kenyan military. And in fact, they were all special forces operators with some paramilitary experience with the CIA. And these guys became the nucleus for trying to figure out what was going on inside Somalia.
But all the spending in the world won't give the CIA the one thing they need most: intelligence on the location of Fazul and Nabhan. They need contacts in Somalia, and despite the increased investment, a year on from 9/11, the trail is still ice cold. Kenyan intelligence and CIA analysts realize that they have no means of guessing where or when the terrorists might strike next. All they can be certain of is, it's only a matter of time before they do. One of the jewels of Kenya's tourist industry is its tropical coastline. And a much sought-after beach resort is the Paradise Hotel, near the busy port of Mombasa. It's popular with Israelis flying in from Tel Aviv for a week in the sun. It's the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Everyone is in festive mood. Suddenly, a car explodes outside the hotel. 16 people are killed, including 10 Kenyans and 3 Israelis. Many more are injured. A mile away at the same time, a chartered passenger flight from Mombasa to Israel takes off carrying 200 holidaymakers heading home. As it leaves the tarmac, 2 surface-to-air missiles streak towards the plane. The missiles only just miss their target. Simultaneous, coordinated attacks, the al-Qaeda signature. Just like the twin bombings of the US embassies 4 years earlier.
They do a 2-prong attack. The first group is 2 suicide bombers that go to the Paradise Hotel, but Nabhan takes on the role of leading this sort of effort at the Mombasa airport. Nabhan actually is the one who fires one of the missiles at the jet. Luckily, neither of the missiles actually hit the jet, but Nabhan sort of led that cell, and with that, he rejoins with the others. They move back to Somalia. And that was really the last time they were at least working in terms of operations there.
For the CIA, an awful reality is dawning. Despite the massive investment in counterterrorism since 9/11, the bombers have struck again, just a few hundred miles from their last attack, in an operation that could have been even more deadly. American and Kenyan agents now realize Al-Qaeda is accelerating its attacks on Western targets. And the CIA will now more than ever need to hunt them down. It's a wake-up call for anyone who thought that the war on terror was going America's way in East Africa. Fazul and Nabhan now base themselves permanently in Somalia, but have a network of operatives who they can use to plan an ambitious series of attacks on Western hotels in Kenya.
One of the low-level operatives that was arrested in Mombasa said that after the Paradise Hotel attacks, he was told to start casing hotels around Mombasa. And Fazul specifically told him to go around those hotels in Mombasa, and that the plan was essentially later on to come back and do another hotel-style attack. But he was seen again, a couple different times on the Kenyan coast coming back down. And what you have to wonder is, was he doing reconnaissance essentially to conduct another attack in Kenya?
And then there's a breakthrough. Satellite phone intercepts reveal a dramatic increase in Al-Qaeda-related activity in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. It suggests that this must be the terrorist cell's base of operations.
The East Africa Al-Qaeda cell started coming and going from Mogadishu back to Kenya. We're talking about a small number of what the US government called high-value targets, maybe 5 people. And that meant that the US now had specific targets of interest in Mogadishu that it was going to try to pursue.
The problem the CIA faces is that they need a presence on the ground in Mogadishu. But that simply isn't possible. Somalia is completely lawless. The US military were driven out 5 years earlier. It's anarchy in which outsiders don't stand a chance. Then critically important information comes to light. Buoyed by their successful attacks in Kenya, the terrorists Fazul and Nabhan have become confident and are starting to raise their profile. It allows the CIA to start picking up their trail. They are forging links with local Somali extremists who are now offering them protection. For the CIA, it's a game changer.
It became increasingly clear that the Al-Qaeda East Africa network had local allies in Somalia, that it was protected by some militias. At that time, they had no name. Their leadership was still unknown, but that there was a nexus in Somalia between Al-Qaeda East Africa and local extremists. And from that point onwards, American counterterrorism efforts really started to focus on the Al-Qaeda leadership in Somalia and their local associates.
The CIA realized that with Al-Qaeda building its presence in Somalia's capital, they have to think the unthinkable. They will have to send agents in a covert operation to the most dangerous place in all Africa for Americans. They turn to the only man who can make that happen. A legendary operative steeped in years of top-secret missions in Africa. Famous for taking extreme risks and getting results in his pursuit of targets. His name is John Bennett.
John Bennett was pretty good at his job. He is entrepreneurial. He is aggressive. He is exactly the sort of person in a war zone that you would want in charge of your operation. He's not afraid to take risks. in an intelligence community that was criticized after 9/11 for being risk adverse. He was the exact opposite.
Bennett is under no illusions about what he faces. He knows that the kind of intelligence network the CIA must build will only be done by experts with years of experience in Africa. And even then, it's a massive task.
Building an intelligence network under those sorts of conditions is extremely, extremely difficult. The other thing that's unique about Somalia, there are lots of foreign cultures that, don't like outsiders. This is very common in places where Al-Qaeda hides, but in Somalia, maybe more than anywhere else, they don't trust foreigners. It's a very clan-based society, and because of that clan basis, how do you essentially build intelligence inside a clan that you have no access to and almost no contact with?
Operating out of the CIA station in Nairobi, Bennett now uses his years of experience working with African guerrilla armies and rebel militias to make a plan to infiltrate Mogadishu. He knows that not everyone in the capital is friendly to Al-Qaeda and the Somali extremists protecting them. If he can make an alliance with their enemies, he might be able to persuade them to help the US. But that means dealing with some of the most dangerous men in Africa. The notorious Somali warlords. Bennett now sends in his best operatives, carrying huge quantities of cash.
The U.S. strategy to apprehend these high-value targets who were coming and going from Mogadishu was to outsource it. The U.S. government turned to the dance partners who were available at the time, a group of clan militia leaders, and in some cases some business leaders with large private militia to guard their properties, and paid them to try to apprehend these East Africa Al-Qaeda cell individuals.
Bennett knows that the one thing that will win over the warlords is old-fashioned bribery. In Mogadishu, more than anywhere else, money talks. His strategy is simple. Cold, hard cash for the people and the intelligence he needs. The better the people, and the more useful the intelligence, the bigger the payoff. In a world where anyone will turn over anyone else for the right price, whoever has the most dollars calls the shots.
It was very dangerous work. The Somali clans will turn you over for a few dollars just as easily as they will to cooperate with you. So Americans operating in that part of the country with these clan leaders, basically, you really took your life in your hands. Whatever access we thought we could get away with, we did. But we had no embassy, no diplomatic cover, no protection under international law if our personnel got caught. It was very dangerous work.
Bennett's gamble with the warlords seems to work. Gradually, they start seizing suspects and turn them over to the CIA.
Some of these figures were engaged then in trying to identify, to track down Al-Qaeda leadership. And there began a process of apprehension of some of the suspects and rendition of some of the suspects.
The only trouble is none of them are the Al-Qaeda bombers Fazul or Nabhan. But if Bennett can't get the people he wants, at least the new alliances with the warlords means he can put in a second line of attack. He turns to a top-secret unit in the CIA, purpose-built for penetrating the toughest environments in covert operations and delivering targets and intelligence. The Special Activities Division. They work with signals specialists called the Intelligence Support Activity. Under the protection of the warlords, they can operate right on Al-Qaeda's doorstep in the Somali capital. They have years of experience tracking insurgents in Afghanistan and are experts in building networks of local agents and informants. They start tapping the cell phone traffic of Mogadishu's terror groups, hunting for clues on the whereabouts of Fazul and Nabhan. And then Bennett deploys a third strategy. Somalia's roads are full of trucks carrying freight across the borders into Kenya and Ethiopia. Drivers and traders travel widely in the country, and for the right price, will act as spies. Almost immediately, Bennett's various intelligence strategies deliver a result. Multiple sources confirm the existence of a new al-Qaeda cell run by Nabhan and a well-advanced plot with the potential for massive casualties. Nabhan is planning to charter a plane and crash it into the US Embassy in Nairobi. 2 truck bombs will explode simultaneously at the gates of the newly rebuilt compound. All flights between Somalia and Kenya are immediately suspended and the embassy is evacuated. The plot is foiled, but it shows the CIA that al-Qaeda is maturing into a determined and well-resourced operation, and its protection in Mogadishu is making it stronger every day. The strategy of CIA boss John Bennett should be yielding suspects and getting investigators closer to the terrorists. But it hits a problem. As the months pass, it's clear that the warlords are taking the CIA's money, but mostly delivering excuses.
The individuals and the clans that they contracted with were not the same sub-clans that were hosting the high-value targets. And so they had great difficulty even moving into, much less reaching into and getting information on those neighborhoods. Secondly, these militia leaders weren't necessarily very interested in the risk involved in going into a safe house and grabbing some very valuable al-Qaeda suspects at the expense of a rival clan, because it could trigger an entire clan war.
It now looks like John Bennett is not getting value for money, and the warlords are treating the Americans with contempt. They know they hold all the cards, and the CIA have no one else to turn to in order to get the people and information they need.
Over time, they were very happy to take the money from the US government, but weren't particularly engaged in apprehending these individuals, and that led to some growing frustration within the US government.
And then there's a new problem. Bennett finds out that the warlords are now faking information and arresting innocent people just to keep the money rolling in. It's looking more and more like the cash payments are turning counter-terrorism intelligence into a business on the streets of Mogadishu.
There were so many people involved, trading on information, selling intelligence, fabricating intelligence, arresting people on speculation that maybe this would be someone the US government would either pay money for or would have an interest in. The apprehension of al-Qaeda suspects was deeply unpopular because warlords were not necessarily discriminating in who they arrested.
Bennett's deals with the warlords are supposed to be a covert operation. But the word is spreading that their clumsy counter-terrorism operations are backed by the CIA. It's making the Americans even more unpopular on the streets of Mogadishu, which plays right into the hands of the extremists.
The involvement of the CIA and possibly other parts of the US government with Somali militia leaders was an open secret. There are very few secrets in Somalia. And some of the warlords who were involved in these operations wanted it to be known that they were friends of the United States and would boast about it. So the nature of US support very quickly became clear that faction leaders were receiving cash payments that they were being given specialized equipment to help them gather intelligence and conduct surveillance on sites they believed were linked with Al-Qaeda.
To complicate matters, Al-Qaeda and their protectors start a pushback against the CIA's bounty hunters, the warlords. Gang warfare erupts on the streets.
You had warlords and militia leaders hunting Al-Qaeda figures and their local Somali affiliates. And on the other hand, the Somali militias associated with Al-Qaeda were starting to identify who was involved in counterterrorism operations and to target their pursuers. So there were reciprocal assassinations and attacks between members of these groups that started to escalate through 2004, 2005, with what effectively became a kind of dirty war in the streets of Mogadishu.
Then the signals specialists, the intelligence support activity, discover from wiretaps a worrying development. Fazul and Nabhan's extremist Somali protectors are rapidly gaining numbers and strength in the capital.
And it was around 2002, 2004 that we began to see the rise of a small militia, a Sharia court militia that was answering to one of about 14 Sharia courts in Mogadishu, almost none of which were radical. They were traditional, they were governed by traditional Sufi clerics and clan elders, but this one Sharia court had radical elements in it, and that militia came to be known eventually as Shabab. And it included some mujahideen who had been in Afghanistan, and that was the link that the East Africa al-Qaeda cell was exploiting there.
The terrorists are now protected by thousands of extreme Islamists who are every bit as dangerous as Al-Qaeda, and their main enemy is the warlords working with the CIA. It couldn't be worse news. The CIA is losing its protection in Mogadishu. The balance of power in the city is switching from the warlords to the extremists. And the Americans are on the wrong side. To the operatives on the ground, despite all their efforts, it looks like the CIA will be driven out of Somalia again.
And then something remarkable happened. The Ethiopian armed forces invaded Somalia.
Ethiopia, Somalia's Christian neighbor, is an ally of the US and more alarmed than anyone at the rise of the extremists in Mogadishu.
Ethiopia was not going to tolerate the rise of an extremist Islamist group in Mogadishu. They had to rid themselves of this emerging threat.
Ethiopia sent over 10,000 troops and captured Mogadishu.
Amazingly, the CIA is back in with a chance. It's about the best Christmas present Bennett could have hoped for. When Ethiopia's army sweeps through Somalia, the CIA gets an open invitation to move as close to the action as they want. The CIA and its special forces now use the Ethiopian army to capture militants and start interrogating them. Before long, vital information comes to light. Fresh intelligence indicates that Al-Qaeda has relocated south to the one place they know they can defend. An island called Ras Kamboni.
Ras Kamboni is a name given to both an island and a coastal area right on the Kenya-Somali border. It's very remote. It was a training base, certainly a spot for provisioning. We know that they were coming and going from that area.
There's a functioning fishing business there, and they actually mention this in their documents, and they say, we have access to the port, it's good for trafficking and moving people, weapons, money, whatever it might be, and it's close to Kenya, it's only a few kilometers away.
Strategically, Ras Kamboni couldn't be a better base. It's protected by swamps inland and is very hard to attack in a ground or sea assault. Analysts believe Fazul and Nabhan are hiding out here. This is the opportunity the CIA has been waiting for. When the Ethiopian army besieges the town, AC-130 gunships are sent in to hit the training camps with lethal force. The camps are flattened, but there's no sign of Fazul or Nabhan. Once again, the Al-Qaeda leaders have slipped through the CIA's net. It's getting harder to avoid the conclusion that the only way to take out the terrorists is by putting boots on the ground and sending in special forces. It will mean risking another Black Hawk Down. Back in Mogadishu, an increasingly unstable political situation means the US is running out of time if it wants to find the bombers. Despite the Ethiopian invasion, Al-Shabaab, the extremist protectors of the Al-Qaeda terrorists, Fazul and Nabhan, is rapidly gaining mass popularity.
At this point, in early 2007, Shabaab morphs from a small, committed Islamist militia of about 400 mujahideen to a much larger movement involving thousands of Somalis who are supporting them tactically. They're supporting them to get the Ethiopian invasion out of Somalia. So Shabaab is in a position now where it captures the flag of anti-Ethiopian sentiment, which is fierce in Somalia.
The CIA knows that Shabaab's power means that it will be increasingly hard to seize their allies Fazul and Nabhan. Then the CIA's Special Activities Division uncovers intelligence that the terrorists have hit a problem. A political crisis in Shabaab means they've started to fight amongst themselves. Fazul and Nabhan's protectors are losing their effectiveness. It might just expose the terrorists and give the CIA the chance it so badly needs.
They have internal clan fighting going on within Shabaab. Who's going to be the leader? You know, who's in charge? Is it more about Somali issues, or is it about these foreign fighters that have come in from all over the world?
The quarreling is forcing one of the bombers, the Al-Qaeda leader Saleh Ali Nabhan, to move more frequently to settle disputes and broker deals. This movement makes him an easy target for surveillance. The CIA quickly trace his safe house in the capital and start a round-the-clock watch. They learn that from time to time, Nabhan travels south of the capital, usually in a single vehicle, and he's lightly armed. The CIA puts forward a plan to senior commanders in Washington to take Nabhan in a snatch operation, dead or alive. It's called Operation Celestial Balance. The US Fifth Fleet is directed to wait off the Somali coast. Silent, miniaturized surveillance drones are launched to watch the roads running south out of Mogadishu.
Navy ships carry their own unmanned drones called Scan Eagles, very small drones which you can launch off the helicopter deck on the back of a frigate or a destroyer. And it's wonderful for doing covert surveillance work. It's quiet, it can stay in the air for upwards of 7 or 8 hours.
CIA surveillance teams on the ground in Mogadishu report that Nabhan is on the move. And the alarm goes up in Washington. He'll be on the road for about 4 hours. At the Pentagon and the White House, officials assemble to discuss the options. The target area is out of range from the nearest drone base, which means a hunter-killer drone strike is not an option. A cruise missile attack runs a high risk of missing a vehicle on the move, and an AC-130 gunship can be evaded by such a small group. With the options narrowing fast, senior commanders in the Pentagon have to consider an operation in the most dangerous country in the world for American soldiers. Commanders insist that if men do go in, they must have the advantage of surprise. But Nabhan is traveling through open country. It's the worst environment for an ambush, so precision in locating him is critical.
The raid would never have been launched unless we had really firm evidence of where Nabhan was physically located. There had to be real-time intelligence from drone reconnaissance.
SEAL Team 6, stationed on a nearby Navy destroyer, now receive their orders. The plan is simple. Make an airborne assault. Scan Eagle's surveillance now proves crucial in tracking Nabhan and his men. As they travel out of the capital, a squad of 4 Little Bird helicopters, backed up by 4 Black Hawks, launches from naval vessels just off the Somali coast. With a fix on Nabhan secured, SEAL Team 6 moves in and engages the Al-Qaeda bomber. Killing him. And everyone with him.
It was unmanned drone video coverage that gave the commandos the location of their target and allowed them to do the job.
Nabhan's body is removed for formal identification and burial at sea. But the CIA's work is not quite finished, and the hunt is on for his fellow Al-Qaeda conspirator, Fazul Mohammed. It's not long before he's located and tracked, and killed in a firefight with the Somali National Army. With the 2 most wanted terrorists in Africa out of action, justice is done for the victims in the US Embassy bombings. It marks a successful conclusion to Operation Celestial Balance and the removal of a major terrorist threat in East Africa. Somalia is closed down as Osama bin Laden's next refuge.